Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Griffin Art Projects is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Stolo nations, and we are very honored and grateful to undertake our work here. So thank you so much for joining us today for Conversations on Collecting with Katherine Clement, Tom Carter, and Julie J. My name is Jazz Keeler, and I am the Contract Virtual Programs Coordinator with Griffin Art Projects. And just very quickly before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping notes. I'd like to mention that you can see us, but we cannot see or hear you today. But we'd like to invite you to get in touch with us using the chat option at the bottom of your page. And also, there will be a Q&A session at the end of this talk. So do feel free at any point, if a question pops into your head, go ahead and type that in the Q&A dialog box, which is actually separate from the chat dialog box at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be looking there for questions once we get to the Q&A section. And you'll also have the opportunity to ask your questions out loud. We'd love to hear your voice, so feel free, if that's your preference, just to indicate in the Q&A dialog box that you'd like to be unmuted. So today's event is presented in conjunction with Griffin's current exhibition, Whose Chinatown? Examining Chinatown Gazes in Art, Archives, and Collections, guest curated by Karen Tam. We would like to thank the Richmond Art Gallery in assisting Griffin Art Projects greatly with this exhibition, as well as the North Vancouver Rec and Culture and Canada Council for the Arts. So we're really thrilled to be hosting today's panelists who will speak about their respective collections, items from each of which are part of the exhibition. So before we jump in, I'd like to share a few installation shots that curator Karen Tam actually sent me. So thanks so much, Karen, for sharing these photos. They really give a nice idea as to how these collection items are exhibited in the space. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly share my screen just to give you an idea. So here we have an installation shot from the Whose Chinatown exhibition, and this is in the Society Hall portion of the exhibition. Here are some items from Tom Carter's collection, items from the Yucho Chow Community Archive, and here again, items from the Tom Carter collection and the Yucho Chow Community Archive. Here we have items from the Beatrice and Raymond J. Cantonese Opera collection. And here you can actually see that there's, you're able to scan this code on your phone and you are able to hear the audio, which is sung by Beatrice and Raymond J. It's a 25-minute audio recording, which is quite lovely. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen here now. So just to give you an idea of the flow of today's presentation, I'm going to introduce each of today's presenters individually, and they'll have the opportunity to share a few words about their collections, and then they'll be coming together for a group chat followed by the audience Q&A. So we're aiming to get to the audience Q&A right around the 45-minute mark today. So the first presenter that I would like to present today is Julie J. And Julie serves on the Board of Trustees of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. She is a former member of the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario and former senior legal counsel with the governments of Ontario, Yukon, and Canada. She is an experienced adjudicator, negotiator, and mediator, and is actively engaged as a volunteer in her communities. Her goal in semi-retirement is to spend at least 1/3 of her time on art. Julie's parents, Beatrice and Raymond J., played an important role in the development of Cantonese opera in Vancouver and Toronto. Their photos, manuscripts, musical scores, performance programs, recordings, and other archival material dating from 1930s to the 1990s form the Beatrice and Raymond J. collection, recently donated by Julie to the University of Toronto's newly launched Chinese Canadian Archive. So thanks so much, Julie, for joining us here today. And I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Jazz, and thanks to the Griffin for giving me the opportunity to show and talk about some of my parents' collection. So I'm going to jump share screen mode here. and just go through a couple of slides and talk about some of the pictures in the collection. So the first, let's see if I can get this going. Okay, so my parents were both born in Canada. My father in 1916 and my mother in 1928. My father went back to China, to Canton at the age of 2, returning as an adult. So he had the benefit of a classical Chinese education and was an extremely gifted multi-instrumentalist musician. And they met through the Tsingwan Music Society in Vancouver, where my mother started performing as a child. And they moved to Toronto. First, my mother moved with her sister in 1950. And ostensibly, they said that they moved for more opportunity in Toronto, but I think that was code for escaping what was at the time quite overt racism, anti-Chinese sentiment in Vancouver. So they did find that Toronto was a better place to be, and my father soon joined and married my mother in Toronto, and they founded the Yit Hoi Cantonese Music Club in Toronto. So this is an early photo of the Tsingwan Music Society. My mother is in the front. She's an 11-year-old girl sitting at the front. My father is 12 years older. So you can see him sitting here, just seated without an instrument to the left and behind her. This is a 1939 studio photo, which I now know through Katherine Clement was taken at Yu Chao Studios. And this photo was a portrait taken to commemorate the Tsingwan Music Society's participation in the One Bowl of Rice fundraising drive in 1939 to help Chinese war refugees. So it's a really interesting photo for me because it's sort of both a family photo, but also very much linked to a historic event and very much kind of captures a moment in history. So you see everyone here is Chinese and they're playing Chinese instruments mostly. So the next photo shows my mother in her other ego as the Chinese Shirley Temple. So she's got her hair done up as Shirley Temple. Her older sister made her outfits copied from Shirley Temple movies, and she learned to tap dance and sing. And I remember being serenaded as a child with the song The Good Ship Lollipop, which was a very popular Shirley Temple melody. So this is sort of an interesting diversion from my mother, I guess, from Chinese opera, but really trying to gain acceptance in mainstream. And one way was connecting to a well-known Hollywood actress and being the sort of exotic Chinese version of Temple. So that's just a little bit about a glimpse into my parents' stage histories in Vancouver. So my mother died 3 years ago at the age of 89. And my father had predeceased her. And so when she died, I had all of their materials. And much was in Chinese, and I can't read Chinese characters. And I could see that there was a lot of musical scores, hundreds of tape recordings with Chinese characters on them, which I couldn't understand. And so I thought, I really need help. And I reached out randomly at being at the Toronto Metro Reference Library and asked if there was any people who would be interested in going through this material with me who could read Chinese. And this led to a very serendipitous meeting with 2 young women from China, Yiming Chen and Ray Zhang. And they not only helped me to organize the material, also helped me to understand how important the material was. And I remember Yiming saying to me that, some of this material was lost during the Cultural Revolution in China. This may be the unique copies of some of this stuff. It's really important and valuable. Don't throw anything out. So that was the first time that I twigged to the fact that maybe this sort of family material was actually something that might be of historical significance and worth collecting. So that led to meetings where I ended up understanding from professors at U of T and librarians and historians that actually this was quite valuable material. So this is one of the flyers from the collection. This is from 1942 or 1943. And the top photo shows my mother in ballet shoes. The bottom is my youngest aunt, Betty, who is doing acrobatics. And what's interesting when I think in the context of history is that this was during the period of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned the entry of Chinese to Canada from 1923 to 1947. And then prior to that, there had been the head tax. So as a result of these very racist policies, there were very few Chinese women in Canada. The ratio at this time was probably maybe 1 woman for every 10 men, and this would be even in the 1940s. So I think young, attractive Chinese women were a very sought out commodity, which would partly explain why my mother became such a popular entertainer in the Chinese community in that time. So this is a later flyer, a program flyer for a production in 1970 in Toronto of a Cantonese opera called Wu Bat Guai. And I wasn't in this opera, but I did perform in other operas also at the Ryerson Theatre. And what surprised me when I've gone back since as an adult to see movies is that it's a massive theater. It seats over 1,200 people. And I remember these shows being sold out. So, you know, there'd be over 1,200 Chinese Canadians watching these Cantonese operas. It was a really big thing in the Chinese community at the time. None of this was ever covered in mainstream media, but it was a really important event for the Chinese community and very much like the soundtrack of my childhood and I think of many people growing up at the time. And my father wrote and the script for this opera, and my mother starred in it. So I learned quite a bit from creating this collection. I think when your parents are alive, you see them just as your parents, like in relation to you. You don't see them objectively. Whereas now I see them as whole figures with separate lives and lives they had before me that were totally different from anything I knew about them. So I've actually learned a lot by just studying these photos and finding out more from what they've left behind. My parents were extremely modest people, and they always counted their fame in the Chinese community, like everyone in the Chinese community knew them, but they would say, oh, well, that's just a Chinese thing. Like we're not, you know, we're not part of the mainstream culture. It doesn't really count, was kind of what they would say. And so I just kind of internalized that and thought that, but now I do understand that their contribution to Canadian culture was very significant, and that's not just Chinese Canadian culture, but this Cantonese opera was very much part of Canada's cultural history and patrimoine as well. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to preserve their legacy. And I think that the very act of creating is a way of signifying that something has value and is worth preserving. And I think for too long, the cultures of racialized minorities, such as Chinese Canadians, were not preserved and their histories weren't told. Now we know that Cantonese opera is part of the heritage of Canada and part of our collective history. And I'm very grateful for exhibitions such as this one for the opportunity to highlight that. So I think I just have one more slide about the benefits of creating and exhibiting a collection. So I've learned a lot starting to share my collection, and you find out from other people who help you make connections and also to help you see things from a different perspective. Even just for this show, my fellow panelists have been able to connect some of the photos that are on display with specific locations or with specific photographers. And I'm continuing to find connections through these photos to historical events and places. So I just have a few photos I want to finish with. Some of these are in the show and some of them are not. So this is I think this is in the show. This is you can just see the words China on the bottom and the words Detroit at the top. So this was the music float, which was part of the 1951 parade, which marked Detroit's 250th anniversary as a city. So over a million people attended this parade, and the Chinese community invited Chinese Canadians and Chinese Americans from many cities where there were large Chinese populations to come and be a part of this parade, to really sort of showcase their presence in the city as Chinese Canadians and be part of this important civic event. So this is in the parade. This is my mother riding a horse, which I never even knew that she would. I was an extremely timid person. I couldn't imagine that she could ride a horse. And not only was she riding a horse, but as you'll see clearly in this photo, she's on the left here, she was dressed as a man in the parade. So she's dressed in Chinese opera costume as a man riding a horse. So it's incredible the things that you find out about your parents, who were clearly very different people from the ones I knew when they were my mother and father. This is my mother and I when I'm about 7 years old. This is in Toronto, Polo Music Club. We're preparing for a Cantonese opera production and have a kind of dress rehearsal, costumes on. So this is just really interesting to not only see my mother as kind of a historical character, but sort of starting to even see myself as a part of history. So really to reflect on this, and it's changed perception of my own kind of history and identity. This is a photo of my mother playing the Chinese yongkam. It's a type of piano. And I thought the backdrop was really interesting. It's obviously an Asian mural or wall painting of some kind. So I sent the photo to the Royal Ontario, and they said, oh yes, this is the 13th century wall painting from China, which is currently in the Bishop White Gallery of Chinese Temple Art. So it's still on display at the museum. And this picture, which is probably from the 60s, it's sort of an interesting way of connecting something from the 13th century and then even now to the present, because it's still in the museum today. So the museum curators were very interested in this photo and possibly finding a way of using some of my collection to connect current museum goers to the Chinese culture and history that starts out in the 13th century and continues through with my mother playing and use on to this day. And this is a photo of my mother singing at Ontario Place in the late 1970s in Toronto. I'm guessing that it was like a multicultural event where there are performers from different groups. And she's wearing a Chinese cheongsam, but otherwise looking pretty Western. And this last photo is my mother and father backstage at an opera. My father was the orchestra leader for the opera, and he's wearing his kind of orchestra leader jacket. And my mother is wearing her opera diva costume. So that's just a little bit of an insight into my parents' collection. And thank you so much for the opportunity to share, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was wonderful. So I am now going to introduce our next speaker, Katherine Clement. Katherine is a community history curator and designer based in Vancouver's Chinatown. Her work focuses on uncovering and sharing the lesser-known stories of the community. She spent 10 years finding and gathering the hidden photographs of Yu Chow, Vancouver's first and most prolific Chinese photographer. The work resulted in a first-ever exhibition in 2019, a book in 2020, and a major community archive of over 550 of Chow's privately held photographs. Katherine has also served as curator for the Chinese Canadian Military Museum, and in 2017, she art directed a Canada 150 exhibit called The Chinatown History Windows, which brought history to the streets. For that project, she designed and installed 22 large format stylized historical photos and stories onto empty storefront windows. So thank you so much, Katherine, for joining us here today.
And welcome everyone. I'm just going to try to share my screen here. There we go. And great. So I'm going to my focus is very much on Vancouver's Chinatown. That's where most of my body of work has been. And I don't really consider myself a collector. I think of myself first and foremost as interested in stories and preserving stories. But I have found that you can't really when you get stories, you get photos along with them. And that photos, in fact, are a really powerful tool for helping people to evoke memories and stories from photographs. So what I want to do here is to quickly go through some photographs that I think help answer some of Karen's questions, which was whose Chinatown and how are these gazes of Chinatown depicted? And what I'm going to do is show you a few of Yucho Chow's photos and what his photos reveal about Chinatown and who it belongs to, as well as a number of personal photographs from family collections that reveal also a lot about how early Chinese specifically, saw their community or captured their community. So Yucho Chow, his gaze as one of the first Chinese commercial photographer in Vancouver was very diverse. So what's interesting about him, this comes from the United Way, the United Church, I should say, is that it depicts mainly early marginalized communities, but not just Chinese. And I think that was what was so fascinating about him, is at a time when many white businesses would not give services to anyone of color or mixed race, he was the one photographer that took people's photos and welcomed them. And in fact, his motto was anything, anytime, anywhere. And he lived up to that motto. So he basically took photos of Chinese and early Sikh Canadians, early Hindu Canadians, Black Canadians, mixed race, and a lot of Eastern Europeans. And I think what he reminds us is that his gaze reminds us that Chinatown was very diverse, and that Chinatown, despite its name, was actually more than for just Chinese. And this is particularly in the first 4 decades of the last century. This is in the 1940s, and it's a boxer and his wife. But what I'd like to do is, because some of these would have not been seen before, what I'm going to show you now is what I call street gazes from the 1930s to the 1980s. And a lot of the work I do is go through people's photo albums and gather their stories. And so I'm always interested in how Chinese depicted Chinatown. And they really didn't, which is what's interesting. This is actually a photo of Yucho Chow. He's there on the left. And this was for a parade in the 1930s, which was for the Golden Jubilee of Vancouver. So the focus is very much on the people, and Chinatown is just the background. It's like the white noise. One of the things in Chinese history is there are a lot of photos of groups, just tons of photos of groups. And this is a photo from the Wong Society, or the Wong Benevolent Society. And this one actually appears in Karen's show. And there are hundreds of these, and that's the nature of clan societies. But what's really interesting is because of scanning, you can actually zoom in on this. And I don't know if you can see it. I'm actually blocked here on my view, but on the top right, there's a fellow looking out the window. Apparently he's the janitor, and he got into this photo. And it also is very revealing because when you scan, you can actually see some incredible details. So the Yen Tong Cafe and the beautiful lights that are hanging in front of that restaurant, the Fat Key, the Hop Lee Co, the children, you'll notice they're mainly boys. And this was actually, children were still relatively rare in Chinatown at this point in time because of the Exclusion Act that Julie mentioned. So interestingly, the Wong Association would record the name of every single Wong child born in Canada, and they still have those books. But these pictures are actually more interesting when scanned, and you can look at them in a lot of detail. Another interesting thing I've noted is that, especially in the 30s, when small cameras started to become available, is that most of the photos are outside and they're of businesses. So the merchant class would be able to take photos of their businesses, and almost never inside though. And I think it was the nature of photography that people couldn't take photos inside that easily because of the need for lighting. But here is Modernized Tailors, which was the last surviving tailoring shop in Vancouver. And you see that great sign off to the left there, Peking Chop Suey. So this is at Pender and Carroll Street. And again, the Chinese don't really focus on the actual, neighborhood itself. They're focusing in on their little business. So here's the Wong Fong watchmaker. I love that you can see his little clocks in the window there. This is for the Kukong Silk Company. And again, just a little brief glimpse into parts of the city, parts of the neighborhood. Same here, this shot's taken in the early 1940s, and you can see the Mandarin Garden quite clearly there. This helps us with dating too, because we don't see the Ho Ho Chop Suey behind there, famous restaurant. And I love that in this photo, even though the gaze is towards these two people, there's this little guy there off to the right who's sweeping, just a street sweeper. I didn't know they had those there. Maybe he was a business owner, but I doubt it by the way he's dressed. And again, this is the BC Royal Cafe, but really the emphasis is on the little girls in the 1940s. A photo taken in front of the H.Y. Louis. So they today are the expanded London Drugs, IGA. The focus in this photo really is the car. But again, it's much of Chinatown becomes like the background noise in these early photos. And things start to change. This is a photo taken on VJ Day. So this was victory over Japan. This is when the Second World War finally ends. So we're in August of 1945. And this is Pender Street. And just look at the incredible crowds. And again, with a close-up, we can see that the crowd is mixed at this time. So everybody is down there for the celebration. Look how deep that crowd is on the street. Off in the background, you can see the BC Royal Cafe sign. So it's through the technology of scanning that we can often go into detail and find some really interesting things in these photos. So this is actually a turning point. After the war, things begin to change. And for the first time, in many of the photo albums I see, you start to see photos taken inside of stores and restaurants. This is inside the BC Royal Cafe. I love the counter with all these men. And it reminds us that Chinatown in Vancouver was very much a bachelor society because of exclusion. So many men were living here for decades on their own and often died on their own, an ocean away from their families. And so these little cafes became important because they had stools, and stools would allow single men to come in and eat and have dinner, but would also give them the chance to talk to someone sitting beside them. So they were purposely designed these very large lunch counters with stools. This is a photo in the 1960s. And again, the emphasis is not really, it's the foreground, it's the lion dancers, or the dragon dancers. But what I find really interesting is this is one of the best photos I've ever seen of the Ding Ho drive-in. This was a Chinese drive-in. So at the kind of late 50s, early 60s, when drive-ins were very popular, and they would have this long tray they would shove through your car. And I can't imagine having chow mein and chopsticks, eating that in your car, but this was a very popular place. Very few photos of signs of what the sign looked like. but here it is, again, taken just by chance in this photo. This is the Han Sing. That's actually, sorry, lion. And what's interesting, as I said, post-war, it's actually not the Chinese that are capturing their neighborhood. Starting in the 1950s, you get a lot of white photographers coming in and being really quite mesmerized by the neon and the exotic kind of look of Vancouver's Chinatown. So this is a very famous postcard, and there's a number of postcards done from this period of the 50s. This is also the period when Fred Herzog comes into Chinatown and he starts taking photos of street life. Again, they're interested just in the capturing the ambiance of the neighborhood. And Karen has some of those Fred Herzogs on display at the show, which are really great to see. A lot of travel magazines, also the NFB, the New York Times, were here taking photos. This is from a beautiful British Columbia magazine. So again, they're interested in just how the neighborhood feels. And then starting sort of in the 70s, you have another wave of often art students coming down to Chinatown with their cameras. And this is Gord McGaw, who's a friend of mine who does a lot of this photography. He just likes to take these little snapshots. You kind of, some of this is kitschy, but it really captures Chinatown. And a wig store, that was a wig shop that was on Pender Street. And this is also the period of time where you have Jim Wong Chu, who's also taking photographs of the neighborhood, sort of just documenting how it looks and feels. And some of his photographs are on display in Karen's exhibition. And lastly, I'm going to end with Paul Yee, who's just one of my favorite people, who has really been very dedicated to the story of the Chinese Canadians and also Chinatown. And again, these are pictures that you wouldn't have found 40 or 50 years before, but this is a photo he took of the Wing Hing. This is in the Vancouver archives. He's donated all his works there. And I think it's so interesting. This looks like a hodgepodge in the window there. There's a little fan in the right side window, a pair of underwear that's been stretched out. This is when they're going out of business. But this was very typical of a lot of Chinatown stores. And this is a lovely interior shot. And again, we don't have, I ask people, Chinese families, why didn't you take any photos inside your restaurant or inside your store? And they said, we just didn't do that. It was a business, we didn't think about it. And that's actually, that attitude is also one of the reasons why so much has been lost in terms of artifacts, because to them, this was just a business. Who would be interested? So that's just a glimpse into some of the ways in which Chinese in Vancouver depicted their community over the years, and how, in fact, it was actually white photographers that took the initial interest in the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katherine. That was wonderful. So I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Tom Carter. Tom Carter is a Vancouver-based painter, collector, and historian whose archival research is centered on local music and entertainment from the first half of the 20th century. His paintings feature scenes from Vancouver's urban landscape, a nod to his work in Vancouver history and research, most notably in the entertainment field. Carter serves on the boards of the Vancouver Historical Society, Friends of the Vancouver City Archives, and the BC Entertainment Hall of Fame. He has worked ceaselessly to preserve Vancouver theatre and nightclub history, buying and preserving and warehousing much of the original Pantage Theatre, 1908, as well as significant artifacts and ephemera of many other venues. As well, Tom has recorded interviews with the pioneers from all of these venues and acquired their papers and personal archives when possible. He has contributed a chapter as well as the cover painting for the recently released Vancouver Confidential, a collection that has topped the bestsellers list. So thank you so much, Tom, for joining us here today.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Jazz, and thanks very much to Karen and the folks at the Griffin for having part of my collection displayed there. And I'm very, very proud to be in such esteemed company as the other people here today, the lovely, lovely ladies. I'll just tell you a little bit about how I started collecting. I started with records as a kid. I started with my grandmother's record collection in the early 70s. I acquired those, and while all my friends were collecting hockey cards and sensible things, I was off combing flea markets and junk shops looking for old music. And it eventually became a collection of about 10,000 records. And some of that I noticed was from Vancouver. There was Vancouver music, and that was of particular interest to me on the Aragon label and radio transcriptions that I acquired from CKWX and OR and that kind of thing. But where my collection really took a serious turn was when I got involved with the Pantages Theatre, and that was when it was going to be restored. I was in there with Heritage Vancouver, and Mark Williams, the owner, was giving us a tour, and we were really excited. And that then took a turn for the worst, and instead of being restored, it was being demolished. So maybe show me the first slide. There you go. That's what the theater looked like when it was still in really beautiful shape. And we were really excited to see it being turned into a first-class venue again. By the time I got in there with John Atkin, next slide, please, this is what it looked like. And so it was in horrible, horrible shape, to say the least. And we were told that it was completely beyond salvation. You couldn't get any of the ornament. There was nothing in there worth saving. Next slide, please. But when I looked around, I saw that a lot of the historic ornament actually was still intact. And so I asked the demolition crew what they were intending to do. Was anything being saved? And it was no. It was all going to be destroyed. So I asked, what could I do to rescue at least some of it? And they said, well, show up with money and we'll sell you things. And so that's what I did. I started coming to the site every day with money, and I bought whatever they would give me. And next slide. Thank you. Pretty soon my living room was looking like this. It was filling up with all of the gilt plaster work, and like that. That's a great example. And as we went further along, they were uncovering, as they were dismantling the theater, they weren't just bulldozing it. They uncovered artifacts in the walls and in little cubby holes. And so there were a lot more interesting things than we first thought, like this barrel. The next slide is this barrel. When it was the State Theater, which was a burlesque house in the 40s, somebody would have worn this on Hastings Street. You can see the ropes were over your shoulders, and you'd walk up and down and use this as a sandwich board. And so I started asking people, well, what was the State Theater, and what was the history behind this place? And not a lot of people knew. So I went down that rabbit hole, and I started to learn about all the theaters that were on Hastings Street. For instance, this was the second Pantages, and it was fabulous. I became friends with the gentleman who tried to save it in the 60s, Arthur Irving. And Arthur and I became friends because we were both the kind of guys who would rescue theater bits and try to save things, and to see the importance of this. And so I worked with Arthur. Like he had all of the blueprints for this theater. He had all the construction documents. And so when Arthur passed, we got his stuff into the Vancouver archives. And then I ended up with some other things. Like here's the next slide. Arthur also had artifacts from the theater, like there's a beautiful exit sign. I ended up with that. I ended up with theater seats. There's the end of one of the theater seats. And so now the next slide is, that got me down the vaudeville path. And so I started buying vaudeville collections. And this is from the collection of Jack Strong. He was a vaudevillian strongman. And this was taken by Yu Cho Chow, because Strong was based here in Vancouver. And here's a couple of Yu Cho Chow photographs I want to show you. This one is, he's balancing her on his chin. Now he's holding her up. And then the next one, she's a contortionist, like a pretzel. And these are fabulous photos, I think. Jack Strong had what he called the Wonder Show, and the Wonder Show traveled all over Western Canada, and it was a small time vaudeville troupe. But what's interesting is next slide, we can actually see that he featured wrestling. Now the photograph that's at the bottom left is a Yu Cho Chow photo that's in Catherine Clement's book, And it's interesting to see how he used the Yu Chow photos in his promotion. So you can see he has feats of strength and he has dancing, clean entertainment. It's a bit of a traveling mishmash variety show. Now it's interesting, vaudeville, which was variety, you'd have say 5 or 6 acts, going around 8 to 10 minutes, and then you'd usually have a headliner. It was in theaters, but in the 30s, it moved into the supper clubs. And the supper clubs, people would sit down, have dinner, and they would watch a vaudeville show on the floor, which is a floor show. And then after that was done, then they'd clean all the tables, all the dishes would go away, and they'd open up the dance floor for an evening of dancing. And so that's kind of where vaudeville moved. And so I was collecting, of course, and I was very interested in that. So I started collecting supper club ephemera as well. And I have a fairly large collection of that. Now, most of the supper clubs were downtown. So the legendary ones like the Palomar, the Cave, the Commodore, we know a lot about those, and there's a lot of photographs and a lot of promotional materials. But there was another supper club scene in Chinatown, and the WK was one of them, and the Mandarin Garden was one. Those were 2 very early ones, which I just love. The Chinatown clubs were a little bit edgier than the downtown clubs, and they were open a lot later. So people would tend to go to the downtown clubs and then pile into cars and go down to Chinatown and continue the party after the Palomar closed. And so the next slide is, oh, actually, this is from Jack Strong again. This is interesting. This shows you, this is a very rare poster. It's made out of newsprint and it's crumbling, but it's interesting to see how a vaudeville show, the lineup went. Okay, the next one, we'll go to the Mandarin Garden. And so they had these table photos. They were souvenir photos that you would have, photographers would move around the restaurant or the club and take your photo, and at the end of the night you could buy it. This is one from the Mandarin from World War II. The next photo is the 2 Air Force guys with their dates at the Mandarin. You can see it's a pretty swanky place. Now the way these worked, of course, is you couldn't buy alcohol there. You'd have to bring it in a hip flask or in your purse or whatever, and just kind of pour your booze into the soft drink that you bought there. Now here's my favorite photo from the Mandarin, and this one is actually in Karen's show. This shows what the crowd was like later in the evening. It's around 1950, and you can see it's a pretty raucous crowd. It's also a very interesting racially mixed crowd. You can see there looks to be an African American woman, and there's Chinese guys, and there looks to be also the ladies at the end of the table look like they're from the nice side of the tracks, whereas the guys on the right looks like they're from the wrong side of the tracks. And that the one lady on the far right looks like she's not going to remember anything tomorrow at all. This is what the Mandarin was like, I've told, and one of the quotes was where the blood ran down the stairs. I don't know how true that is, but it only lasted till 1952, and then they tore it down to widen Columbia Street. So the Mandarin was actually on the gravel alley that was Columbia. Now, next to the Mandarin, that now became the corner of Pender and Columbia, and that's where the Forbidden City ran from 55 to 59. Here's a table photo from the Forbidden City. And then inside, we can see that the Forbidden City was really quite a swanky place. Next photo, please. And yeah, it's quite a high-tone place, beautiful. And interesting to me is the telephones on the wall. It looks like there's ones facing each table. And I would love to talk to anybody who had been in the club in the 50s. Was it like in the nightclubs in the 80s where you could actually call from table to table? I don't know. But this photo is interesting. It's the only time I've seen that. Now, the Forbidden City lasted till 59, and then it was taken over by the Louis family, who rebranded it as the Marco Polo. And that brings us back to Karen's exhibit, because I have the Marco Polo scrapbooks. Now, the Marco Polo was a legendary club, but nothing exists. Like, we couldn't find menus or interior photos or anything from it. And we just knew that it was one of the big 3 nightclubs of the 60s. There was the Cave, Izzy's, and the Marco Polo, but nothing could be found from it. So I was visiting a dealer that I buy things from occasionally, and he said, "Oh, I have some Bill Haley and the Comets for you." So he opened this book. He says, "This just came in yesterday." And he was about to rip the pink flyer on the left. He was about to tear it out of the book. And he says, "Anything else in here you want, you can just rip it out." And so I started to look through this book, and you can see everything is Marco Polo. So let's look at the next page, please. Yeah, there you go. And there's Billy Haley in the comments, the complimentary pass. There's the China dolls. I looked through the book and I was astounded that everything was either addressed to Victor Louis or from Victor Louis, and it was all interior and behind the scenes stuff from Marco Polo. And I thought, oh my God, this must be the owner's scrapbooks, which is just a treasure for those of us who wanted to know what Marco Polo was like. Next photo, please. There's the Bill Haley photo, and it's fascinating what it shows when you scan these small photos and zoom up. Look at the cocktail waitress in bunny ears. And there's a couple of photos that show these girls in pink outfits with bunny ears. And there's a waiter to the right in a red jacket, very sharp. It just is a marvelous looking place. Also in the books, next photo, please. There was these pages that Mr. Louis had written down of every single act that played in the club from 64 to 68. And so it's fantastic. It's like a Rosetta Stone of what happened inside on their entertainment bill. Second from the top, we can see that there's Nina Simone. Now, this is astounding because this is the only time she ever came to Vancouver was for this engagement at the Marco Polo. And a little further down is Earl Father Hines. You look through, there's like the Fifth Dimension, there's Red Fox, Richard Pryor. It's a who's who of 60s entertainment came through that club on Penry Street, which is fascinating. But there are some other treasures in the Marco Polo books. Next slide, we can see there's all of these photographs. Now, I don't know who took them. The photographer is not credited, but you can see wonderful glimpses of Penry Street. And I think lastly, do we have another photo? There you go. This is one of my favorites in the books, and there's Mr. Louis and the China dolls. And I love the fact that that this collection has been miraculously saved, and now it's on display at the Griffin, and soon it'll be in the Vancouver Archives, which is really where it belongs. So that concludes my little presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom. And thank you so much to Katherine and Julie as well for these really wonderful and insightful presentations. I think just to be mindful of time, and we really want to make sure that we have enough time for audience Q&A, I think we'll open it up to questions in just a moment. But first, I'd like to introduce Karen Tam, who's also going to be joining us for questions this afternoon. And Karen is, of course, the curator of Whose Chinatown. So Karen is a Montreal-based artist and curator. She holds an MFA in sculpture from the School of Art Institute of Chicago and a PhD in cultural studies from Goldsmiths University of London. And if you haven't seen it already, Karen led a curator's tour where you'll be able to see the exhibition. So be sure to check that out, which is currently posted on YouTube. And Karen is represented by Galerie Hugh Charbonneau in Montreal. So a big thank you to Karen, Julie, Katherine, and Tom. And I am going to spotlight each of you, and we'll open it up to questions in just a moment. Okay, so for questions, I see one that we have in the Q&A dialog box, which I'll read out in just a moment. I'm going to be hopping on here with my voice, but if you would like to ask your question out loud, just indicate that in the Q&A dialog box, and I am very happy to unmute you. So if that's your preference, do just let us know. So we do have a question waiting here for us. Sourcing and collecting are the initial challenges. Then comes storage and preservation. How would this be typically addressed?
You want to go, Tom? Since you still have all this stuff in your house?
Yeah, I do, and I'm thinking, oh boy, that's a big question. You know, the more you acquire, actually, as I said earlier, it took a serious turn with the Pantages. Before that, I was just collecting for my own pleasure, and I was collecting things that I thought I didn't really. I was serious as far as I loved this stuff. It was fun to play with, but it was when I started to get things that I thought this is actually of significance to Vancouver and to other Vancouverites. And this is the only copy, and it's not. I felt uncomfortable having it here because I thought, man, if I had a fire or a flood, this stuff is gone, and it's too important. If you're looking at a collection of Beatles records or something, there are other copies of them out there. You know, you can get that collection back. But say with the Marco Polo scrapbooks is a great example. It's quite fragile, as you know, Karen. I mean, you need to, every time you open it, little bits and pieces might fall off. And yeah, really. And I thought, man, I shouldn't have this. I shouldn't have this. The Jack Strong collection, actually, I talked to Special Collections at UBC, who's probably going to be taking that. And the curator there said to me, "You shouldn't have this. This is too important for you to have." And she's right, because she says it's not don't have a climate controlled environment. It's not in Hollinger boxes and acid free. So to answer that question, I think you have to be very careful with this stuff and make sure that you get it to the highest and best place as soon as you possibly can. Yeah, which is what I'm doing.
Can I add on a question that perhaps for Julie is, when did you feel like it was the right time to kind of to give up or to donate to give it to the University of Toronto's Chinese Canadian Archive, and why did you choose them?
Sure, thanks for that. I think as soon as I had all of the material, I realized, and especially having talked to, by this time, a number of professors at U of T, that it was valuable and was of interest. And there were actually two possible, like very obvious places it could have gone to, because the Metro Reference Library in Toronto has its own Chinese Canadian archive. And then there's the U of T archive. So really it was simply, I was already in contact with the U people, and that they assured me that they would digitize it and like store it in a way which would eventually be accessible to the public, which I have to say that has not happened yet. Like, it's a very time consuming process to actually go through that. So I guess, and at the time I did briefly contact the Metro Reference Library, but they didn't have a full-time curator and nobody ever called me back. So it was just sort of one of those things that it seemed like U of T was ready and had the resources and was interested. So I went with them. But I also digitized all the photos, the main ones, myself before I donated them, because I was concerned. And I also bought a machine to digitize the audio tapes. So I copied about 35 of them, of about 200 tapes, just to make sure, because tapes degrade really quickly. And who knows how many years before they actually are digitized. So that was just kind of my own insurance to feel confident that no matter what happened, they would be protected, or at least a part of the collection would be secured. But the goal is really public access. And that is, I think, what U of T is planning. So hopefully that will happen soon.
Right. And can I ask a question for Katherine? Is like, how did you come about to consider creating this digital community archive, which is, I mean, it's so important. What led you to doing?
Well, I think it's because I didn't want anybody else to repeat 10 years of work I had done. It had to be a digital archive, because for many of these families, this is their one and only copy of a photo of their great-grandmother or great-grandfather or whatever. And I found that people were more willing to share if they knew that I was just taking a digital copy and the story that goes with it. So it made sense. And those who know the story of Yu Chow is that all his work was thrown out when his studio closed. So even though there were thousands and thousands of Yu Chow photos out there, they were all hidden and squirreled away in people's basements and boxes. And but yeah, so ideally I'd love to have a real hard copy collection, but it has to be a digital collection, at least at this point in time.
Right. And do you have plans for where or who will be hosting, or that's sort of in the process?
I'm in the process right now. I'm just actually working on the cataloging of it and trying to get a handle on how many I actually have, because I think it's more than I realized. So,
thanks.
Can I just make one comment, though, which is interesting, because we are talking about collections, and yet my experience, especially in Vancouver's Chinatown, is the sadness I feel about how much has been lost. And I mean, I'm so grateful to Tom for saving, or to the original person who found that in the dumpster of the Marco Polo albums, because there was, you know, I think for a lot of these families, like when their parents died or grandparents died, here you have this, you know, business with all this paper, and a lot of it's not organized, and also artifacts, and it's just stuff they want to get rid of. And as a result, I cannot believe how many families running famous stores and businesses, there is nothing left. It all went into the dumpster.
You know, on a positive note, though, Katherine, it's remarkable how much is still around. And when you find things that you think, okay, it's got to be gone, nobody would have had that, and then it shows up somehow miraculously. It's really amazing. For instance, we were talking the other day about how an exhibit like this is so incredibly important, because people then are aware that the Marco Polo, for instance, or anything in all of our collections, that these things actually still do exist. And then they go, hey, wait a minute, I have something that you might think is interesting. Now, so images from the Marco Polo stuff were posted on Facebook. It's gone all over the place. It's been in a couple of books, it's been in newspapers, and it's been on Facebook. And so I think his name, David Lee, his father had the Mei Ling and the Forbidden City. And so he posted all sorts of interior photos of the Forbidden City, fabulous photos. And he posted saying, well, I can't believe people are so interested in the Marco Polo. Maybe they'd be interested in the Forbidden City. And I contacted him and I say, oh my God, this is amazing. I can't believe that you even think this is interesting. And so there you go. Who knows what else is out there that we haven't found yet?
That's true. That's true. Yes.
For instance, what you've done with Yucha Chow is amazing, because people wouldn't know that they have a Yucha Chow until you told them what furniture to look for and what backgrounds. And now all of these things, we know that they're Yucha Chows, and now they're making their way to you, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
Amazing. I'm going to jump in here. I have a few questions for us in the Q&A. The first question, is there evidence of Chinese opera in Vancouver like it was in Toronto?
Yes, I'll jump in and answer that. So there is still, even now, there's Cantonese opera. So there is a Cantonese Opera Society, like an amateur group in Vancouver. And even the group that Mark was and Father were in when they were very young has some presence. And I believe my friend Yi Ming searched their website, and it's found that it even still referred to my mother, even though she left in 1950. So that's sort of interesting, because of course they were, you know, mostly well known before the internet age. So there's very little like internet records of them, but it's amazing what you're able to find if you dig. So I think that Cantonese opera is still happening, and probably more so in Vancouver than in Toronto now. There is some opera happening, but I'd say in both places, but also in both places, not nearly as active as when I was a child. So it's not the cohesive force that everybody in the Chinese community is interested in. It's more of a specialty kind of entertainment, as sort of non-Chinese opera is in the mainstream community. It's sort of a niche thing.
Thanks so much, Julie. So we have a question from Griffin Art Projects director, Lisa Baldessera. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Lisa, who will be joining. You should be able to. Go ahead, Lisa.
Hello to everyone. I'm just so thrilled to hear these stories. I just want to thank you all so much for sharing them today. And thanks to Karen for putting all of you together. Thank you so much for this work. And you know, one of the mandates of Griffin Art Projects is looking at collections. And I think this is the first time that we've talked about how collecting can mitigate against this kind of historical, architectural, and cultural disappearance that takes place. And it's just such profound work to do. And I'm also so curious about how each of you came to it so uniquely through your own families and noticing. And I wondered, you know, for young curators, and by that I mean people early in their curating, not age related, but people who might be in the middle of something like this that they haven't thought of as being important collection or work, what your advice to them might be in terms of noticing and preservation. And you've covered some of it already, but I'm sure there are people listening. I think we have almost 100 people listening today who have something that is incredible to share in order to attest to a history that might be hidden currently. So just wonder what your advice might be to them. And thank you all so much.
Well, I guess the advice that I would give is to get your collection out there, to get people to know about it. Because if you have something, in a box squirreled away under the stairs, how can anybody possibly tell you what is in that photograph or in that collection, or maybe join it? I think we collect pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and I have some pieces and you have some pieces. We all have little pieces, and when we put our pieces together, suddenly you get a bigger picture that you could not have seen in those pieces. And that's literally true. When you think of with both Katherine and Julie, I've actually studied. I have the blueprints of the theater on Columbia Street where this opera was happening, or that I actually owned Yu Chou photos and I didn't even know it. So we've actually crossed each other's collections, which is wonderful. And I've learned just from our. So I think that would be my advice. Sorry for taking lots of time, but just get your collection out there.
Yeah. I would also recommend too that once you know what something is and it's who's in it and what the story is to ensure you document that. It's so easy for photos to go silent very quickly. One generation will know what the story is, and then it's lost. And once it's lost, sometimes it's lost for good. Not always, but often. And so the importance of documenting what you know about a particular item or photograph is very important for its longevity.
Yeah, I would add also that I think all art tells a story. And so if you're trying to put together you should think, what is the story that I'm trying to tell with this collection? I also agree very much with Katherine that if you can talk to people while they're still alive, like the people who were in the photos, definitely do that and, make digital things of them talking about giving life to the story. It's something I so wish I had done with my parents before they died. And there are so many questions now I would like to ask them, and it's too late. So just take the opportunity you can to speak to those older lives who are connected to those photos and memorabilia, so that you can bring out the story that makes it worth collecting.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. It's just absolutely thrilling, and wow, even the tip of the iceberg that we saw in those few minutes of your presentation. So thank you again, all of you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we have just two more questions here waiting for us. And the first is actually relates to Lisa's and just thinking of new generations of collectors and curators. So I'll go ahead and read it. The panelist discussion raises questions around the idea of posterity. The people presented in today's photographs and recordings thought there was nothing worthy of preserving. Is there more conscious collecting of Chinese Canadian artifacts in recent generations? Who is doing this?
I can only talk about my own experience with families, is that it's very hit and miss. I meet, sometimes if I can find one person in a family that really cares about history or once they start hearing the story gets engaged, they'll often be the one who will take the lead to try to preserve things, or at least to document things. But it's my experience just working with families and gathering stories through families, it's that it can be very hit and miss. But it's, all history, and I'm more of it from the history side, all history is just a great story. And once people sometimes hear it, it makes them engage. So another project I'm working on right now, a lot of people have these particular documents, identification documents in their drawers and things like that, and have not paid any attention to them. But through this project I'm doing now, and we're talking about what the historical significance of that document, what the story that it narrates to us, suddenly there's all this interest, and people who didn't take an interest in their family history are suddenly, looking in Library and Archives Canada and doing a lot of Google searches. So they got turned on to their family story, but it can still be hit and miss.
Thanks, Katherine. Okay, we have, I think, time for one more question. Okay, so we have someone who writes, I think of Faye Lung, who frequented the dancing clubs. Have you talked with Faye? Maybe she has picture albums. So maybe just more of a comment or a tidbit. Thank you so much for sharing that.
I think Faye's writing her own book, I had heard.
That's what I heard too, yeah.
Yes, I haven't, but haven't seen it published yet. So I just only got so much material.
Yeah. It'll be a very interesting book. That is for sure.
Can I ask one question of Karen?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, sorry to put you on the spot. So in doing this project, and gathering, different kinds of mediums and how Chinatown has sort of been viewed in different ways over different time periods, what's the one impression that you've had from this experience of curating this show?
I think I'm just so touched and still very much moved by the warmth and generous spirit that everyone that I've kind of been in touch with and had conversations regarding, their, say, like your collections or the artists whose works are in the show, or people who have just helped me with the research or put me in touch with different folks. I think it's that, and kind of it just feels in a way like a family reunion, and that we're all kind of together, kind of in a way perhaps like filling some of these gaps, in our family history, and that like all of these are part of our family album. So yeah, that's like one of the things that it's been such a wonderful experience.
Wonderful, thanks so much. So I'm going to jump back on here just for a moment, because I'd like to say just a huge thank you to Katherine, Julie, Tom, and Karen for sharing these wonderful stories and insights into your personal collections and into the exhibition. So a huge thanks on behalf of Griffin, and a big thanks also to everyone who took the time to join us here this afternoon. And if you haven't had a chance to visit the exhibition yet and are in the area, Griffin is open on Saturdays from noon to 5 p.m. And we are asking, just with the new guidelines, we're asking that people book in advance. So we actually, if you go to our website, www.griffinartprojects.ca, we have a brand new website. And if you click on the exhibition, you'll find a calendar and you'll be able to book a time and date to come visit us. So we do hope that you're able to make it to the gallery space. And also on our brand new website, you'll notice that we have a large number of upcoming Zoom events in conjunction with both the exhibition and our residency program. So definitely check that out. We hope to see you again. And we have been recording this talk. So once it's edited, you'll be able to find it on our website as well. So a huge thanks again to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you.
Thanks, Karen, too.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.